The mud caked my boots, heavy and cold, as I shuffled forward in the line of silent ghosts. Slept. We waited for breath that smelled of boiled cabbage and desperation, keeping our eyes on the wet pavement. Then I saw her. A pristine silver ghost in a sea of gray rubble, standing beside a black SUV. At a soup kitchen in a war-torn city, my wealthy grandmother found me in a line for food. She shook, clutching her pearls, and asked the question that changed everything. "Where did your trust fund go?" I didn't answer because the words made no sense to my starving brain. Trust fund. I was just trying to survive until the curfew sirens wailed. My hands were cracked and bleeding, from digging through debris for scrap metal, while hers were manicured and trembling. I hadn't spoken English in months, only the broken local dialect necessary to beg for work. She stepped toward me, her Italian leather heels sinking into the muck, ignoring the armed guards flanking her. She looked like an alien species here. "Get him," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the sight of me. Before I could explain that I had no money, two men in tactical gear grabbed my arms. I flinched, expecting a beating, my body tightening into a defensive coil learned from 3 years in this hell. But they didn't strike me. They guided me with firm, professional grips toward the armored vehicle. The people in line behind me didn't look up. In this city, when men with guns took you away, you didn't come back. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing out the damp chill and the distant sound of mortar fire. The silence inside was instant and absolute, pressurized like a bank vault. The air conditioning hummed, smelling of expensive leather and vanilla, a scent so clean it made me nauseous. I sat on the plush seat, leaving a stain of grime on the beige upholstery. My grandmother sat opposite me, staring as if I were a corpse that had climbed out of a shallow grave to haunt her. "Marcus told me you were in Zurich," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He sends me your report cards every Friday." I laughed then, a dry, rasping sound that hurt my throat. Zurich. I had been dropped at a reform camp that didn't exist, abandoned when the shelling started, left to rot in a country whose name I couldn't even pronounce at first. Marcus, my stepfather, hadn't sent me to school. He had exiled me to the end of the world to die quietly. The driver accelerated, the armored tires crushing the debris of my temporary life. I watched, through the tinted glass, as the soup kitchen faded into the gray fog. I had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to eat trash, to sleep with one eye open. Now I was being dragged back to a home that had erased me. As the city disappeared, I realized the war wasn't over. The battlefield had just shifted from these bombed out streets to a quiet mansion in Connecticut. The shower on the jet was hot enough to scald, but I couldn't feel clean. The water ran brown at first, swirling down the drain with 3 years of accumulated grime. I stared at my reflection in the gold-trimmed mirror, hardly recognizing the face looking back. My ribs pushed against my skin like the bars of a cage, and my eyes were hollow caves. I put on the clothes the stewardess provided, soft cashmere that felt heavy on my shoulders. I wasn't a grandson returning home. I was evidence. In the main cabin, a spread of food waited on a white linen tablecloth. Roast chicken, glazed vegetables, fresh bread. The smell made my stomach cramp violently. Eleanor watched me from her seat, a tablet propped open in her hands. She didn't eat. She just stared at the plate, then at me, as if trying to reconcile the boy she remembered with the skeleton sitting across from her. I picked up a roll, my hand shaking uncontrollably. "Eat," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed rage. She slid the tablet across the mahogany table. The headmaster said you were excelling in French, she said, her voice brittle. He sent photos of you skiing. I looked at the screen. The emails were detailed, filled with glowing reports of my progress and behavioral breakthroughs. There were pictures, too, distant shots of a boy in ski gear who vaguely resembled me from behind. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Marcus had been writing a novel while I was starving in a war zone. I don't ski, I said, my voice rough from dessous. Marcus drove me to the airport 3 years ago. He took my passport. I pushed the tablet away, disgusted by the images. He put me on a cargo plane to an airstrip, outside the city you just found me in. The camp was a warehouse. It closed 6 months later when the militia moved in. Eleanor's face went pale, the blood draining away, until she looked like the marble statues in her garden. She tapped the screen, bringing up a spreadsheet filled with numbers that made my head spin. Your grandfather left $2 million for your 18th birthday, she said. The trust was structured for education and medical emergencies. She pointed to a column of withdrawals. $50,000 a month for tuition, emergency surgeries, therapy retreats. The total at the bottom was zero. The money hadn't just disappeared. It had been siphoned off with surgical precision, while I fought rats for scraps. I looked closer at the header of the latest email from the headmaster. It was dated yesterday. Grandma, I said, pointing to the technical details at the bottom of the chain. Look at the IP address. She squinted, confused by the string of numbers. It's the same as the sender, I explained, tapping the screen. That's not a Swiss server. That's a local provider. I paused, letting the horror sink in. That email was sent from inside your house. The pilot announced our descent, the engine shifting pitch as we banked toward the coastline. The city lights of home sprawled below us, a grid of electricity and safety that felt like a lie. Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear tracking through her perfect makeup. I wasn't just a survivor returning from a war zone anymore. I was a weapon Marcus had forgotten to unload. The landing gear deployed, with a heavy thud, sounding exactly like a chambering round. The estate smelled of lavender and old money, a sharp contrast to the sulfur of the front lines. Eleanor ushered me into the west wing before sunrise, locking the heavy oak doors behind her. She needed time to freeze the accounts. Before Marcus knew, I was back on American soil. I stood in the center of the pristine room, feeling like a contagion in a sterile lab. The silence here was heavy, not empty. It pressed against my ears, louder than the shelling I had grown used to. I couldn't stay contained. I crept to the balcony door, cracking it open just enough to see the sprawling lawn below. A garden brunch was in full swing, white tents fluttering in the gentle breeze. Marcus stood near the fountain, laughing with a glass of champagne in his hand. He looked golden, untouchable. Then the sunlight caught his wrist. He was wearing my father's vintage Patek Philippe, the one promised to me. It glinted like a stolen trophy, mocking my poverty. Anger overrode my instructions to stay put. I slipped out of the room and moved through the servant corridors, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. I passed a maid arranging hydrangeas in the hallway. She dropped the vase, the porcelain, shattering with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. She stared at my hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, terror in her gaze. I put a finger to my lips. She nodded slowly, stepping back against the wall, and I kept moving toward the study. The library doors were ajar. Inside, Marcus sat at the mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of $100 bills. He counted them with frantic intensity, muttering numbers under his breath. I stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Marcus froze. He looked up, his eyes widening until they showed white all around. The crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand slipped. It hit the floor and shattered, soaking the Persian rug in amber liquid and shards of expensive glass. Austin. He breathed the name like a curse. He scrambled back in his leather chair, nearly tipping it over. For a second, I saw raw, unfiltered panic. He wasn't looking at a son, he was looking at a reckoning. I stood still, letting him take in my emaciated frame. "I thought you were in Europe," he stammered, his gaze darting to the cash on the desk. He tried to cover the piles with a newspaper, his hands shaking violently as he failed to hide the evidence. The shock vanished, replaced instantly by a predator's instinct. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket, his face hardening into a mask of false concern. "How did you escape?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a growl. "The facility said you were a flight risk. You are dangerous." He wasn't asking about my health. He was building his defense, planting the seeds of insanity before I could speak. He stepped toward me, posture threatening, expecting the cowering boy I used to be. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the watch on his wrist. My father's watch. "I didn't escape rehab, Marcus," I said quietly. "I survived the war you sent me to." He stopped, his jaw tightening. He reached for the phone on his desk, his eyes cold and dead. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked how I got back, and that told me everything I needed to know about the danger I was still in. I was an error to be corrected. The law firm was a fortress of glass and steel hovering 40 floors above Manhattan. Eleanor marched past the reception desk, her cane striking the marble floor like a war drum. I trailed behind in a borrowed suit that hung loosely on my skeletal frame, feeling the eyes of paralegals tracking my movements. We weren't here for a consultation. We were here for an autopsy of my stolen life. The conference room doors swung open, revealing a long table buried under bankers' boxes. Sarah, the forensic accountant, didn't offer sympathy. She offered spreadsheets. She was a sharp woman with glasses perched on her nose and a laptop that hummed like a hive. "The trust was drained systematically," she said, projecting a JAG graph onto the wall. "Shell companies masked as educational consultants. Tuition payments to schools that don't exist." I watched the red lines on the screen plummet. Each dip represented a meal I missed, or a night I spent shivering in the mud. She tapped a key, highlighting a series of transfers to an entity called Global Scholastic Solutions. "These look legitimate on the surface," Sarah explained, her voice devoid of emotion. "But the funds were immediately bounced to offshore accounts in the Caymans, then withdrawn in cash." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Cash?" she asked. Sarah nodded grimly. "Untraceable. Or it would have been, if he hadn't gotten sloppy with his personal expenses during the exact same transaction windows." Sarah pulled up a map of Las Vegas alongside the bank records. "These withdrawals coincide with stays at the Bellagio," she said. I leaned forward, staring at the dates. October 14th, November 22nd. "He told me he was visiting you in Zurich on those dates," Eleanor whispered, her face pale. I remembered those days clearly. October 14th was the day the militia burned the food warehouse. I had eaten boiled shoe leather while Marcus was betting my tuition on black at the roulette table. "It gets worse," Sarah said, sliding a thick dossier across the polished wood. "The cash didn't just stay in the casino. We found payments to known associates of organized crime in Jersey." She showed us surveillance photos of Marcus handing envelopes to men in parked cars. "He wasn't just a thief, He was a desperate debtor. The millions he stole from me hadn't bought him a yacht. They had just bought him time. He was drowning, and he used my inheritance as a life raft. Sarah hesitated before opening the final file. There is one more financial instrument we found tied to the trust, she said softly. She laid out a life insurance policy with a payout of $5 million. It was taken out 3 years ago. The beneficiary is Marcus. I read the fine print. The policy covered accidental death in foreign conflict zones. He hadn't just sent me away to get rid of me. He sent me away as a speculative investment. The room spun. The air conditioning felt suddenly frigid, biting through my suit. He increased the coverage last month, Sarah added, pointing to a recent addendum. That explained the panic in his eyes at the estate. My survival wasn't a miracle to him. It was a financial catastrophe. Eleanor gripped my hand. Her fingers cold as ice, realizing the depth of the betrayal. I wasn't just a cash cow to Marcus. I was worth more dead than alive, and I had walked into his slaughterhouse. The dining room felt like a courtroom, the long mahogany table stretching between us like a no-man's land. Marcus sat at the head, carving the roast beef with a steady hand that belied the panic I had seen earlier. He wore a fresh suit, his hair slicked back. The perfect image of the grieving guardian. I sat on his right, the smell of the meat turning my stomach. He smiled at Eleanor, offering her the first slice. It's good to have the family whole again. He lied. We need to address the elephant in the room, Marcus said, setting down the knife. He looked at me with pity, not anger. Austin has been through a traumatic episode. The facility warned me about this. Relapse is common. He turned to Eleanor, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The drugs they found in his dorm in Zurich. They cause hallucinations, paranoia. He might believe things that aren't real. He was rewriting my history in real time, painting me as an addict to cover his theft. He reached under the table and produced a manila folder, sliding it across the polished wood toward my grandmother. I didn't want to show you these, Eleanor. I wanted to protect his memory. She opened it. I saw the forged letterhead of the Swiss police. It detailed an arrest for heroin possession and a psychotic break. It was a good forgery, likely expensive. He needs professional help, Marcus insisted. A secure facility. Immediately. He was trying to lock me away before the lawyers called. I didn't shout. I didn't flip the table. 3 years in a war zone had taught me that the loudest man is usually the most scared. I watched Marcus instead. I saw the bead of sweat trapped in his hairline. I saw the way his left eye twitched when he looked at the grandfather clock. He checked his phone under the napkin every 30 seconds. He wasn't a concerned father, he was a man waiting for a bomb to go off. 42 Volgograd Street, I said softly, cutting through his monologue. Marcus froze, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. It wasn't a school, Marcus. It was a repurposed textile factory. I kept my voice flat, devoid of the emotion he wanted me to show. The roof collapsed on the 3rd day. We slept on pallets. There were no ski trips. Just a ration of rice and the sound of mortars. I looked directly at Eleanor. Ask him what the tuition covered. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, rattling the fine china. Stop it, he snapped, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. See. He's delusional. He's making up stories to hide his addiction. He stood up, towering over me, trying to use his size to intimidate. I paid a fortune to get you the best care in Europe. You threw it away. He was shouting now, desperate to drown out the truth. But his eyes were darting to the exits. Eleanor didn't look at the fake reports. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes locked on Marcus, her expression unreadable and cold as stone. She slowly closed the folder and placed her hand over it, not as acceptance, but as a judge delivering a verdict. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating his shouted lies. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked his chair over, realizing his usual charm was useless against the silence of two people who knew exactly who he was. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, the sound vibrating through the library floorboards like a slow, dying heartbeat. I stood by the stone fireplace, watching the embers fade, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing me afraid. He locked the heavy oak doors, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the cavernous room like a gunshot. Gone was the polished socialite from dinner. In his place stood a man, unraveling. He poured a drink, his hands shaking so badly the crystal decanter clinked against the glass, spilling amber liquid. "It was a bridge loan," he said, his voice raspy and devoid of the earlier charm. He paced the Persian rug, wearing a path into the expensive wool with his pacing. The market turned. "Austin, I was leveraged. I needed liquidity to save the estate, to save your inheritance." He spoke as if he had done me a favor by robbing me blind. I intended to pay it back. Every cent. It was the lie of every thief. He looked at me, pleading for understanding, but I saw only greed. He moved to a hidden safe behind a landscape painting, spinning the dial with frantic precision. The heavy door swung open, revealing stacks of cash bundled in rubber bands. 500,000, he said, dumping the piles onto the desk. Cash. Untraceable. He pulled a passport from the safe. My passport. And a ticket to anywhere. Bali. Rio. You disappear. Live like a king. He pushed the money toward me. Sign a waiver clearing me of wrongdoing, and you walk out of here tonight. No questions asked. I didn't move toward the money, so he changed tactics, his face twisting into a sneer. "Or you stay," he hissed, leaning over the desk. "And I make sure the police find a stash of heroin in your room within the hour." He tapped his phone screen aggressively. "I have friends on the force. A troubled addict, fresh from rehab, overdosing in the guest wing. It writes itself." The threat hung heavy in the air. He wasn't bluffing. He would destroy my future to secure his own comfort. For a moment, the old fear gripped my chest, tight and cold. I was 14 again, powerless against his word. I looked at the cash. It was enough to vanish, to never feel hunger again. I could take it and run, leave this toxic house behind forever. But then the smell of the library, leather and dust, shifted in my memory to the scent of wet concrete and boiled cabbage. I saw the faces of the friends I left in the food line. If I took this money, I became him. I looked at the money, then up at his sweating face. "Keep it," I said, my voice steady. "I don't want your money, Marcus. I want the truth on the record." The silence that followed was absolute. He stared at me, unable to comprehend a world where money didn't solve the problem. "I am not leaving," I continued, stepping closer to the desk. "And I'm not signing anything." I had spent 3 years surviving monsters. I wasn't going to be bought by a coward in a tailored suit. The choice was made. He lunged at me, a desperate, feral growl tearing from his throat. He aimed a wild punch at my head, fueled by panic and scotch. I didn't even blink. I stepped inside his guard, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back with a movement drilled into me by necessity. I pinned him against the desk, his face pressed into the piles of cash he worshipped. He struggled, breathless and weak, a soft man who had never fought for anything real. "It's over," I whispered. "Don't make this worse." I shoved him away, and he stumbled back, clutching his wrist. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing in the dim light. The voice memo app was running, capturing every word of his bribe and his threat. Sent, I said, tapping the screen to upload the file to the cloud. Eleanor has it. My lawyer has it. Marcus stared at the phone as if it were a gun. The color drained from his face, leaving him gray and ghostly. He slumped into his chair, defeated by his own arrogance. He didn't plead for mercy from the law. He looked at the window, terrified of the dark. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not just the fraud. The people I borrowed from, they don't file lawsuits." He looked at me with genuine terror. "They gave me until tomorrow to pay the interest. If I don't have access to the trust, I am a dead man." The $500,000 on the desk wasn't a bribe. It was the only thing keeping his kneecaps intact. I realized then that my refusal wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a death sentence for him. He had gambled everything on my compliance, and he had lost. "That sounds like a you problem," I said, turning toward the door. He scrambled to gather the cash, his fingers fumbling, but it was too little, too late. I watched the blood drain from his face, not because of the police, but because he realized he had finally run out of pawns to sacrifice to his own predators. The estate's silence shattered at dawn with the wail of sirens cutting through the mist. Blue and red strobes painted the library walls, washing over Marcus's pale face in violent rhythm. He bolted for the window, knocking over a bust of Caesar, his composure fracturing completely. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the flashing lights, looking like an avenging angel. "I called them 10 minutes ago," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "The recording I sent was enough for a warrant." Marcus didn't argue. He scrambled toward the French doors leading to the gardens, fumbling with the brass latch. I knew this house better than he did. I knew where the shadows gathered, and where the gates locked. I moved to cut him off, my body remembering the agility learned in the ruins. He threw the doors open, but I was already there, blocking the path to the driveway. He skidded to a halt on the limestone, panting like a trapped animal, realizing there was nowhere left to run. "Austin, please," he wheezed, backing away until his heels hit the fountain's edge. "Think about the scandal. The family name." He reached out a trembling hand, trying to conjure the fatherly authority he had weaponized for years. "I raised you. I took you in when your father died." It was a sickening performance. I looked at him and saw only a small, pathetic man who had built a kingdom on the bones of a child. "You didn't raise me," I said, stepping closer. "You just spent me." The police swarmed the garden, weapons drawn but lowered when they saw he was unarmed. 2 officers grabbed Marcus, forcing him face first onto the damp grass. The brutality of it felt strangely clinical. I watched as they cuffed his hands behind his back, the metal clicking shut with a sound of finality. He screamed about his rights, about his lawyers, but his voice was thin and reedy in the open air. As they hauled him up, mud stained his expensive Italian suit, marking him permanently. Eleanor walked onto the grass, ignoring the dew soaking her slippers. She didn't look at the police cars, she looked only at me. Her hands shook as she reached out, touching my arm as if checking for fractures. "I should have flown there myself," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through her powder. "I trusted the paperwork. I am so sorry." I saw the guilt eating her alive. "You are here now," I said, covering her hand with mine. "She saved me in the end, and that had to be enough." A black sedan pulled up behind the cruisers, depositing the family attorney, Mr. Henderson. He looked tired, clutching a briefcase against his chest. He huddled with us on the terrace, speaking in hushed tones. To avoid the press gathering at the gates. We can handle this quietly, he suggested, glancing at the neighbors' windows. A private plea a deal. We recover the assets. He goes away. No headlines. It was the safe route. The path that protected the Maddox legacy from public scrutiny and shame. I looked at the police car where Marcus sat, his face pressed against the glass. If we buried this, he would find another victim in 5 years. He would charm another widow, steal another fortune. No, I said, my voice cutting through the lawyer's murmur. Full prosecution. I want everything on the record. Henderson blinked, surprised by the steel in my tone. Every dime he stole. Every fake school. Put it all in the open. I wasn't protecting the name anymore. I was burning the infection out. The fallout was immediate and physical. By noon, a forensic team was tagging the furniture in the house. They seized the cars, the art, and the safe full of cash Marcus had tried to bribe me with. I watched him carry out the portrait of him that hung in the foyer, treating it like evidence rather than art. Sarah, the accountant, worked in the library, tracing the remaining funds. The trust is mostly gone, she confirmed. But liquidating his personal holdings will cover a fraction of the debt. Sarah called me over to the desk later that afternoon. A strange expression on her face. Austin, about those dangerous creditors he mentioned, she said, turning the laptop screen toward me. They don't exist. She pointed to a complex web of transactions. He was transferring the money to crypto wallets he controlled, creating fake threats to justify the liquidity. The loan sharks were just another ghost story. He wasn't scared for his life. He was scared of losing his retirement fund. He was a coward to the bone. The police finally cleared out as the sun dipped low, leaving tire tracks in the manicured lawn. The house felt massive and empty, stripped of the tension that had filled it for days. I stood on the front steps, breathing in air that finally tasted clean. The nightmare of the soup kitchen and the golden cage was over. As the sirens faded into the distance, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was the heavy, solid silence of a slate wiped clean. The winter wind bit at my exposed cheeks, carrying the familiar scent of coal smoke and wet concrete. This time, however, I wasn't huddled in a doorway praying for warmth. I stood on the back of a flatbed truck, shouting instructions in the local dialect to a line of eager volunteers. We weren't unloading scrap metal. We were unloading insulated tents and medical crates paid for by a liquidated Connecticut estate. I caught my reflection in the truck's side mirror. The hollows in my cheeks were gone, filled in by months of steady meals and purpose. I jumped down, my boots hitting the mud with a solid, confident thud. The line for the soup kitchen stretched around the block, just as it had the day Eleanor found me. But now, the roof was patched, and the smell of boiling cabbage had been replaced by hearty beef stew. I watched a teenager near the front, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold. He looked at me with the same feral distrust I used to wear. I didn't look away. I nodded. Acknowledging the invisible war, he was still fighting inside his head. A black sedan navigated the potholed street, looking absurdly sleek against the backdrop of shelled buildings. Eleanor stepped out, clutching her coat tight against the chill. She didn't bring a security detail this time, just a heavy envelope tucked under her arm. She walked through the slush, ruining another pair of expensive shoes without a second thought. She watched the operation with a mixture of pride and lingering sorrow. Marcus pleaded guilty yesterday, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. 10 years. No parole. The news felt distant, like a story about a stranger. She handed me the envelope, her hand trembling slightly in the cold air. Inside was an acceptance letter to a university in Washington, D.C. The program focused on international law and human rights. "You don't have to stay here to prove you survived, Austin," she said gently. "You can come home. We can rebuild the rest together." I looked at the paper, then back at the distribution line where families were receiving blankets. The trust fund was gone, burned by a gambler's greed, but the wreckage of Marcus's life had bought all of this. "I'll come back for the fall semester," I said, folding the letter into my pocket. "But I need to finish the winter distribution here first." Eleanor nodded, understanding that this wasn't a rejection of her, but an acceptance of myself. For years, I believed Marcus's lie that I was broken, a problem to be discarded in the dark. Standing here, directing the flow of aid, I realized he was wrong. I wasn't broken by the world. I had been forged by it. The metal that goes through the fire always comes out stronger. I walked over to the serving station, taking the ladle from a tired volunteer. The teenager I had spotted earlier stepped up, holding out a battered tin bowl. I filled it to the brim, adding an extra piece of warm bread on the side. "Eat," I told him in his own language. He looked up, surprised by the native words coming from a guy in an American coat. I smiled, not with pity, but with solidarity. I lost the trust fund I never knew I had, but in the ruins I found my own worth.